We couldn't do what we do with terrific supporters and sponsors, and I want to recognize our sponsors here this morning, led by Duane Morris. You'll hear from partner Rich Cohen shortly. Eisner Amper, RSM, the Penn Center for Innovation, and Fox Rothschild. We're going to start with a presentation on predicted MedTech trends from Pedro Arboleda, Managing Director of Deloitte Consulting. We're going to have a Q&A with him, so we'll tell you how to submit your questions in just a minute here, led by Rich Cohen from Duane Morris. And then halfway through, we're going to shift gears and we're going to do a panel discussion on the MedTech funding landscape and outlook for next year, moderated by Michael Harrington from Fox Rothschild. A few etiquette, and for those of you who have participated, you certainly know these by now. All attendees are muted. We're going to use the Q&A window to ask any panelists questions. You can also use the chat function to chat with other attendees or to Danielle Pinto, who is hosting this call. But again, use the Q&A window to ask panelists questions. We'll pick those up. And that's about it. Let me, without further ado, introduce Pedro Arboleda, who is Managing Director with Deloitte. Pedro's based up in Boston and is obviously part of the MedTech team at Deloitte. We're very fortunate to have Deloitte as a strong member of PACT and excited to have Pedro here this morning. Pedro, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dean, and hello to everyone. Hopefully my presentation is coming up on your screens. If you could just confirm, Dean or Richard, that'd be great. Can you see my presentation?
Yeah, we can see it.
Perfect. So thanks everyone for your time today. I'm going to spend about 15 or so minutes just going over a couple of slides just to facilitate a conversation really. And it's based on some material that Deloitte published last year around how could MedTech companies envision collaborating with consumer technology companies in this race to really win and capture value in new ways, really. And I'm going to put in a wrinkle around, you know, how this has changed, how the narrative has changed slightly because of COVID, but you'll see pretty early on that if anything, COVID has just accelerated these trends. And so we'll you know, kind of have a chance to talk about that in the Q&A as well. You know, as our paper and our report posits, you know, all these changes, the innovation cycles that we see, which are, you know, after having done this over a period of 18 months, we studied this in depth. We had 180 people contribute to this report. This future health story really is unfolding because of some underlying capabilities that you see on the left there, on the lower left, which we all very well aware of. I'm not going to retread that. But the innovation cycles being what they are, about 7 years, we work closely with you know, various groups at MIT and Singularity around understanding these innovation cycles. And certainly we've seen that, you know, events such as COVID only accelerate these trends, right? And just to take two examples, you know, we've seen the rise of telehealth. Really, it was already there, it was already coming along, but fairly incrementally. We've seen an explosion of the use of telehealth and in digital virtual means of engaging patients, physicians. And this goes all the way, not just for care management, but also for the way, for example, sales teams are interacting with physicians and providers in new ways. So, you know, certainly that's part of the acceleration. And obviously, you know, demand for procedures has been affected, and there's now a need to rethink how to best keep tabs on patients beyond the high acuity centers, right? It used to be very normal to just have a patient come in, right? And so COVID's changed that behavior somewhat. It's people are reticent to come into to hospitals for fear of infection. And so that triggers a whole need to have a better remote diagnostic and monitoring platform to take advantage of you know, ways that you could peer into the health of patients. So just to say that the trends that were articulated in that report, and I'll provide a link to the report at the end of the presentation to make this presentation available to everyone on the call. So no need to take too many notes, but we'll kind of go through that at the end. So in the paper, we also talk about how this research that we looked into really uncovered a number of roles and archetypes that MedTech companies could and need to really take advantage of if they're going to win in this race to providing better value for for the products and services they provide. So, obviously, when you think about the marriage of MedTech companies and consumer technology companies, oftentimes the reaction from my clients, and I have everything from very large MedTech clients to startups, is they're somewhat wary, right? I mean, you have these very deep-pocketed consumer technology companies coming into the healthcare space, making very large plays, and oftentimes the first reaction is, I don't want to give away my IP or my know-how to these very formidable competitors. But I think that leaves a lot on the table, and the report points out various ways in which you can take advantage in a sort of co-opetition perspective, some of the capabilities that these consumer technologies companies have, and in particular around data and platforms, right? I mean, they're famous for having created platforms in the first place. These platforms are now being extended to areas that cover health, right? And so it's a natural extension. If you hear CEOs of some of these consumer technology companies talk about it, they feel like their future versions will only be talked about within the context of health. I mean, certainly in the case of Apple, you have the CEO talking about the importance of health in their future state. So, the convening of the data, the insight generation from the algorithms that are trained on those very large data sets that go beyond the therapeutic area in a lot of ways. And obviously, device companies have data themselves, but what we're positing here is that the data that you could train those algorithms on can benefit from these platforms that these companies have built, because they are extremely good at curating that data and stitching together insights that are way beyond what a MedTech company would have access to. And they've really created the underlying infrastructure for that to happen. And as we know, these consumer technology companies are also incredibly good at knowing the consumer, right? And that's not been a place where MedTech companies have traditionally played or been very concerned about. MedTech companies, as we know, have focused on providers and physicians as their core audience and core customer group. And so the knowledge that these consumer technologies companies have of consumers also becomes another capability that could be very, very well suited to MedTech companies as they go closer and closer to the consumer, as the consumer now becomes a much more present buyer of devices and decisions that inform the purchase and use of those devices. And so you're starting to see that play itself out. Now, we went around and asked various experts, who's going to be driving this innovation as we think about MedTech, consumer technology companies, and other stakeholders in the health ecosystem. And certainly you could see, at least from the group that we surveyed, there's a lot of sharing of that innovation value by MedTech and consumer tech, but both on the digitally connected devices perspective, on wearable devices, diagnostic implants, but also in the aggregation and collection and insight generation that's going to be required for that data to be really brought to its fullest potential. And obviously on robotics, the device companies still have a predominant share of the value creation, at least from this expert panel. But it stands to reason that that capability can only be enhanced by collaboration with consumer technology companies. And so when you sort of then step back and think, well, okay, so it seems MedTech and consumer tech can get together and create lots of value and capture that value. How? On the right-hand side, we have ways, at least, that we can certainly think about that value being generated. And I mentioned remote patient monitoring, right? I mean, sort of creating the platform that allows you to aggregate signals and data from multiple sources, fund the devices themselves, of course, but also marry it to complementary data sets around patients. If you have asthma, it's not just the device data from that asthma device inhaler, but also the air quality in your house, in your office, in your car, places where you spend a lot of time and that matter. And so aggregating these types of signals more comprehensively and holistically become a joint solution that could generate incredible amounts of value. You obviously have the integration of this data, the interoperability becoming less and less of a concern these days as we continue to try to slay that monster. That's become a lot more present and a lot more available if we get together as a medtech industry, if we get together with some of the consumer technology companies that are managing these data sets, and of course improving productivity on the delivery of care. Obviously, everything from virtual clinical trials to how to train clinicians on how to better use equipment and devices, that's all going to depend on creating digital twins of the operating room, creating digital twins of the lab, creating ways in which humans interact with your devices and equipment. And that could only be benefited from the capabilities, again, that the consumer technology companies have at their disposal. They've invested quite a lot of money in. Again, I'm going through this fairly quickly because I want to get to some Q&A. This just sets up this other trend, that's the shift to alternative sites of care. And we all know about that. And again, COVID's only accelerated that. I think if you look on the right-hand side, you have some reasons to believe why, the shift to the home has now become front and center. That's certainly why a number of companies are investing in capabilities that allow them to deliver at least some of the care at home. Obviously, some procedures will always have to be done at the hospital in the acute setting, but for certain interactions, that's certainly the case. Home health can really do a great job. And then retail health, obviously, another big growth area, 20% growth, CAGR growth there. Again, these slides are going to be provided at the end. So, if you'd like to look at the data more closely, I'd be happy to do that. The large trends that we've observed around the future of health, around data sharing, we certainly see, and here we have a point of view on not just the trends themselves across the top, but how we are seeing COVID impact these trends. So data sharing has only become much more prolific. You have examples of even non-HIPAA compliant tools at least being used temporarily, Zoom, and the telehealth solutions that are being used and tested, very well received by physicians and patients alike. Stands to reason that it'll have to be HIPAA compliant again after this initial phase of the pandemic. But nevertheless, it points to this whole notion that the sharing of this data, across health systems in a particular city or region, becomes a very important component of managing and delivering care. The interoperability I mentioned before, these are trends that have been going on for a long time. CMS is behind a number of these. The regulations have become a lot more present in terms of interoperability. The reimbursement it has also become much more feasible. You could make a case that COVID's only increased that, and the portability of the records, the EHR records, diagnostic and monitoring, and the testing that goes on now in some cases remotely is only increasing that. One of the trends that we do see being somewhat affected negatively by COVID is access, right? I mean, 38 million Americans now lost their jobs. It's estimated that between 10 million or 11 million of those Americans will not be getting insured. Some of them are going to go to ACA, some of them are going to get covered by Medicaid, but some are not going to get insured, right? I mean, some are going to remain uninsured, and that's a problem. We see some issues with certain communities that have been disproportionately affected in getting access to healthcare. And so that's a concern, and that certainly will need to be addressed. And then there'll be some companies that attempt to address it and create a lot of value from that. The other trends around the empowered consumer, I mean, consumers, again, 30%, before the crisis, 30% of consumers were on high deductible plans. already covered workers were on high deductible plans. So they were paying for the most of their healthcare during the year. That's only getting accelerated in terms of how much they're at the decision, at the table to make a decision on procedures, devices. So that I think, you know, they're much more well informed. You had an uptick in the way people looked at health as a result of COVID. So we see that trend accelerating. We see behaviors being changed, you know, things that were not thought of as being feasible or now very quickly being feasible. You know, the at-home consults, the consumers being much more hungry for information about health. Obviously, scientific breakthroughs, they're going to need their table stakes. You still need to produce amazing world-class products to make it out there in the marketplace. But you know, the approval process, at least during the pandemic, have obviously become faster. And there's things that were completely unheard of are now happening in terms of the acceleration of R&D and development efforts. But we'll see if that continues. We'll see if there's behaviors that are changed on that front as well. So these are just some trends. Happy to talk about these in the Q&A. I know we're leaving some time for that, Richard, and I'm happy to start a conversation within the context of these trends.
Yeah, no, thanks a lot. Again, I'm Rich Cohen with Duane Morris. We're, as always, happy to partner with PACT, longtime sponsors. If you have any questions, as Danielle had put in the chat, please put it in the Q&A, and we will pass them along to Pedro. I guess, Pedro, first question, starting off, just one that I have is, you know, during COVID, we've seen a lot of opportunities for our emerging business clients to partner on technologies, both consumer and MedTech, with larger entities that probably or maybe would have done those things in-house in the past. And just wanted to get your take on that trend, particularly in MedTech and with the big healthcare systems.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So, look, I mean, I think, you know, a lot of MedTech companies, certainly the large MedTech companies, have amazing data science teams, and you know, they've been at this game for a while now, right? I mean, they develop world-class products. Those products that are connected have signals and data coming from them. Those signals and data, they're being trained, and algorithms are being deployed, and AI capabilities are being deployed as well to train those algorithms, and you know, and insights are being generated all the time, right? The question now becomes, can you improve the predictive power of those algorithms, right? And can you, as a MedTech company, even a small company, a startup, can you access a better insight generation engine, right? And so where do you look for that? Well, some of the best companies out there that have insight generation engines are the consumer technology companies, right? Because they've been dealing with massive data sets for a long time as well. And so you have examples of MedTech companies, providers, and consumer technology companies getting together. I mean, you can sort of point to, for example, what Mayo's doing with Google. It's a public announcement that they made about Google's co-locating data science teams in Rochester, Minnesota, helping to buttress Mayo's already formidable data science team and capabilities, and bringing to bear some of the assets that Google has around AI and the DeepMind unit that they have in London that they've now brought over to the US is certainly an example of that. These are capabilities that take a lot of money to develop, right? I mean, the talent war for AI talent is massive, right? It costs a lot of money, multi-millions of dollars in some cases for the best AI talent. So if you're a startup, let's take Echo, for example, that has also a partnership with Mayo. You could leverage that platform, that notion that a Google Mayo Echo team could do something really incredible together. And that you don't have to necessarily be a large MedTech company to take advantage of that type of capability. You just have to be able to knock on some doors and start those types of conversations, and realize that while your algorithms might be good, they could certainly be enhanced by this access to this much broader capability set that these companies bring.
We have a couple questions from the crowd. Again, if you have a question, please post it in the Q&A or in the chat. We'll monitor both. So if you have a question, just let us know. One of the questions is, with the growth of telemedicine, how do you see that impacting reimbursements from carriers to hospitals and doctors?
Yeah, I mean, you're already starting to see reimbursement rules be much more user-friendly for telehealth consults and consultations. I mean, they are in some cases still less than the in-person visit, right? But you're starting to see some wiggle room there from the regulatory side in terms of really creating the enhancements and the reimbursement guidelines for those types of visits, the telehealth, the virtual visits, to be reimbursed at a similar rate, or even in some cases the same rate. I think, you know, our point of view is that trend's only going to develop. I mean, obviously the regulatory bodies really want to make sure that this continues and this happens, and they don't want people not getting the access to care that they need, right? And so what are some ways to do that? You make it feasible for companies to pull that off and to create the infrastructure, the underlying infrastructure to create, you know, to have access to those conversations. So, I mean, we see that trend being a positive trend. And I think it depends, again, on how productive you know, the productivity and the cost containment, because you could go, you know, I mean, this could go many which ways. You could have a really expensive version of that consult, or you could have the good enough version that gets you connected into the patient that then leads to other, you know, needs, healthcare needs downstream. So.
Okay. Next question is from Sean O'Brien, and his question is, with more data, value-based contracting can be achieved, and he wants to know what your experience is with payers, providers' willingness to share data to make value-based contracting a reality. Right.
Yeah, I mean, this value-based healthcare and contracting has been with us again as a trend that's been there for a while now, a number of years. I think companies are trying out different things, right? So if you see what Philips is doing with 9 health systems, starting with Jackson Health, they started in 2018. And they are taking over a lot of the hardware and software needs of that health system of Jackson Health and 9 other systems, Bon Secours, Banner Health, or that they've signed contracts with. And what they're doing is they're taking the cost of the hardware and software off the P&L of the providers. And they're saying to the providers, you know, pay us on a per patient, per use basis for the use of those devices, and not just the Philips devices, any of the devices the healthcare system uses, but that is jointly managed with Philips. And we will create the insight engine behind which we will better understand how those patients flow through your health system, right? And they're 11-year contracts, so they're long-term bets. They're very aggressive, and they point to this notion that Philips, you know, is now really becoming it's not just a med device company, it's also a software company, right? And they spend 60% of their R&D budget on software. And that's, you know, that's a traditional MedTech company that's sort of, and rightly proud of a lot of the MedTech devices. You know, they're seeing software as a major investment area and major focus area. And so what are they going to do? They're going to learn from all the other assets they bought along the way, the population health assets they bought. They're going to start to do some population health assessments of the patients flowing through those health systems, and they're going to manage those patients in different ways through different segments. And then they're likely to use those to go at risk with the providers on the management, on maybe with the payers, on the management of those patients, because they're going to learn so much, right? They're going to have a holistic view of those patients. They have devices where, you know, at home as well, as you know, Philips has a number of those devices. So they're going to just follow those patients through the system, through these systems, and go at risk in some cases. But they need to collect a body of data. They need to coalesce it, curate it, analyze it, to then be be really good and at the predictive element that then is underpinning the contracts, right?
Right. Another related question from Frederick Jones. Are payers willing to pay for monthly data subscriptions and monitoring when they're used to paying one-time fee at the time of implant?
This is the business model question. You know, I think jury's still out, right? I mean, these are business model questions that are being tested in the marketplace at this point, and you know, nobody knows necessarily right now what's going to stick. It's also the case that these platforms are only now getting built up, right? I mean, they're nascent. It takes a bit of time to generate the big data sets and to train the algorithms and to improve them beyond the narrow use cases that we've been seeing up to now. So, I mean, I think, you know, once we start seeing evidence that these platforms are delivering better insights, better clinical insights, then you'll start to see a migration to, you know, to really being able to charge those types of, monthly rates. But I mean, right now I think everybody's on a race to try to prove that their platform is the best, right? And that's going to, again, depend on the big data sets, the data science teams, and the last mile, right? We often forget, like, you could have the best infrastructure, data science teams, the best algorithms. If you don't change the patient and physician behavior on the last mile, then it really didn't amount to much. So, you know, we often advise our clients to pair up their data science teams with the behavioral scientists to try to make sense of how this gets inserted into the clinical workflow, how the insights get used, what the follow through is, and that's somewhere where payers and others are fairly well entrenched, and where they could be partners for medtech companies and consumer technology companies.
Right. Okay. And one last question, and our segment time will be up. 9 months ago, Congress had a focus on targeting biopharma medtech as a cause of the healthcare costs with regulation and price controls, but were diverted by COVID. And now the industry is the hero. When do you see Congress redirecting focus back to industry? End of the year, beginning of next year, is it off the table entirely?
Yeah. Look, I mean, I think, you know, as was clearly or is clearly being demonstrated by COVID, you know, where do people turn for hope, right? I mean, where is that? What are the types of companies and capabilities that are going to need it to get us out of this pandemic? And oftentimes they reside in the pharmaceutical and medical technology companies that are at the heart of some of these solutions, whether it be the testing, the diagnostic tests, whether it be the vaccine development. I mean, these are real solutions that are going to bring real value to society, right? And we've seen the economic effects of what this has done to us, right? I think the reframing of the conversation about the value that these companies make, I think, is going to be pretty profound. But you know, companies are still going to be required to bring to market products that are going to create solutions, right? And they're going to create better clinical outcomes. That's not going to stop. And better productivity, right? I mean, we often forget that the AI, and I've certainly had a lot of my provider clients tell me that the most useful AI is really right now is for clinical workflow productivity issue, you know, scheduling, things like that necessarily don't have to do necessarily straight to the patient, but that are just the operations of a hospital system, around the operations of a hospital system. So the efficiencies that are going to be needed to be generated from medtech companies and pharma companies are still going to be, you know, have to be, you know, required and expected by society.